Scottsdale, Arizona, at the turn of the new millennium, was the kind of suburban community that sold the American dream. Wide streets lined with palm trees, stucco homes with red-tiled roofs, and desert skies that stretched endlessly over the horizon. On those streets, children played in driveways, neighbors watered their lawns, and families gathered in backyards for barbecues. Among the many houses that seemed to represent stability and comfort was the Fisher residence, a modest, single-story home where a family of 4 lived. On the surface, Robert and Mary Fisher's household looked no different from those of their neighbors. But appearances can be deceiving, and beneath the surface of that quiet home lay a growing storm, one that would erupt in unspeakable violence on the morning of April 10, 2001. Robert William Fisher was born on April 13, 1961, in Brooklyn, New York. His early childhood was marked by instability that would shape much of his adult life. When he was just 15, his parents' marriage collapsed and his mother left the family. For Robert, the divorce was a wound that never healed. Friends and acquaintances later recalled that he never fully forgave his mother for leaving, and he carried with him a deep resentment and fear of abandonment. This experience forged in him a rigid belief that divorce was unacceptable, something he would later forcefully impose on his own marriage. By the time he was in his 20s, Robert had carved a disciplined, if not entirely steady path for himself. He served briefly in the Navy, trained as a surgical catheter technician, and even worked as a firefighter. To many, he seemed like the model of masculinity and order, a man who could handle stress and responsibility. Yet those who knew him well often described another side, a man who was quick-tempered, controlling, and deeply insecure. He was devoutly religious, but his faith often manifested not in compassion or humility, but in rigid moral expectations that he demanded from others, particularly his wife. Robert met Mary Cooper in the late 1980s, and they married soon after. Together they had 2 children, Brittany, born in 1989, and Bobby, born in 1991. To neighbors and friends, the Fishers looked like a typical American family. Mary was quiet, kind, and devoted to her children. She worked part-time while also tending to the household, and she often appeared cheerful, if somewhat weary when seen in public. Robert, meanwhile, maintained his role as breadwinner and patriarch, though in private he was less the protective father and more the authoritarian presence. The cracks in their marriage were visible to those who spent time around them. Friends reported that Robert was controlling, especially toward Mary. He restricted her independence, criticized her frequently, and displayed jealousy and suspicion when she interacted with other men. Mary confided to a close friend that Robert had once told her he would never allow their marriage to end in divorce, no matter how unhappy either of them became. It was a chilling declaration, one that hinted at the extreme lengths he might go to in order to enforce his will. Robert's own behavior contradicted his proclaimed devotion to family and faith. In the late 1990s, he reportedly engaged in an extramarital affair, a betrayal that nearly shattered his marriage. The affair was deeply humiliating for Mary, and the couple entered counseling in an attempt to mend their relationship. Yet the therapy seemed to achieve little. Robert's temper persisted, and Mary often appeared withdrawn. By 2001, divorce rumors were circulating among those closest to them. Mary had allegedly begun to consider separating from Robert, a decision that, given his obsessive views on divorce, may have been a dangerous step. Despite the tensions, daily life for the Fishers moved along with a facade of normalcy. Brittany, at 12, was described as a bright and energetic girl who loved school and spending time with her friends. Bobby, 10, enjoyed sports and was especially fond of his father when they went fishing or camping together. To outsiders, the children seemed happy and well-adjusted. Neighbors often saw them playing in the yard or riding their bicycles, with Mary watching protectively from the porch. But behind the closed doors of the Fisher home, Mary carried the burden of a crumbling marriage and the constant pressure of Robert's demands. By early April 2001, tension inside the home was at a breaking point. On April 9th, neighbors heard loud arguments coming from the Fisher residence. It was not unusual. The couple argued frequently, but this fight was intense enough that neighbors recalled it distinctly after the tragedy that followed. The argument reportedly centered on Mary's growing dissatisfaction and Robert's fear that she might leave him. For Robert, the thought of divorce was intolerable. It meant not only public humiliation, but also the recreation of the trauma he had endured as a teenager when his own mother had walked away. The day after the argument, in the early hours of April 10th, something inside Robert Fisher snapped. What happened next would devastate Scottsdale, shock the nation, and forever place his name among the most notorious family annihilators in American history. As the city of Scottsdale slept, the Fisher household became a place of horror. Robert methodically carried out a series of brutal acts that would wipe away his entire family in a single night. For Mary, Brittany, and Bobby, there would be no escape from the violence that Robert had decided would be their fate. Part 1 ends with the looming shadow of what is to come. The murders, the explosion, and Robert's disappearance would transform an ordinary suburban family into the subject of one of the FBI's longest-running manhunts. The night of April 9, 2001, was tense inside the Fisher household. Neighbors later told investigators that raised voices had carried through the walls, echoing into the suburban calm of Scottsdale. The Fishers had fought before, but something about this argument felt heavier, more final, as though Mary had reached a point of no return. She was rumored to be considering divorce, and Robert, carrying the scars of his own parents' separation, could not abide that thought. His control over Mary and the family's image had always mattered more to him than their happiness. For him, divorce meant betrayal and public disgrace, and he had made it clear he would never let it happen. As the household quieted after midnight, an eerie calm fell. Mary and the children retreated to their bedrooms, perhaps in exhaustion, perhaps in resignation. But Robert was not finished. In the silence of those early morning hours, he made a choice that would transform his family home into a crime scene remembered across the country. At some point between midnight and 4 a.m., Robert Fisher carried out the murders. Investigators later pieced together the brutality of his actions. He attacked Mary first. She was found with her throat cut and a gunshot wound to the back of her head, a combination of violence that suggested rage and certainty. She had no chance of survival, no opportunity to fight back. Whether she had been asleep or awake when he struck, the violence was swift and absolute. After killing his wife, Robert turned to his children. Brittany, 12 years old, and Bobby, 10, were asleep in their bedrooms. They were innocent, unaware, lost in dreams. Robert slit their throats as they slept. There was no struggle, no scream heard by neighbors, only a father ending the lives of the children who trusted him most. To this day, investigators struggle to understand how a man could look at his own children and choose such an act. Yet to Robert, it may have been, in his twisted reasoning, the only way to keep his family together permanently. If Mary was leaving him, then none of them would leave at all. The violence was only the beginning. After killing his family, Robert staged the next phase: destruction. He rigged the house by pulling out the natural gas line and pouring accelerants, creating an environment primed for explosion. His intent was clear: obliterate the scene, burn away the evidence, and erase the traces of what had happened inside those walls. At approximately 8:42 a.m. on April 10th, the house erupted in flames. The explosion shook the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors rushed outside, startled by the force of the blast and the sight of flames consuming the Fisher home. Windows shattered, debris rained down, and black smoke climbed into the Arizona sky. First responders were quickly on the scene, battling the fire as shocked residents looked on. For many, the sight was surreal. They believed at first that it was a tragic accident, perhaps a gas leak. No one imagined that the inferno was concealing 3 bodies inside. When firefighters managed to control the blaze and investigators entered the remains of the home, the truth emerged. In the master bedroom lay Mary Fisher, her throat cut and a bullet wound in her skull. In nearby bedrooms, Brittany and Bobby were found, their throats slashed as they had slept. The explosion had charred parts of the house, but the bodies told the story with grim clarity. This was no accident. This was murder. The discovery rocked the community. Scottsdale was not the kind of place where entire families were wiped out in a night of blood and fire. Neighbors who had seen Robert mowing the lawn, Mary chatting politely, and the children riding bikes were suddenly forced to confront the horror that the family next door had been destroyed by its own patriarch. But where was Robert? As investigators searched the ruins, they found no trace of him. He was not among the dead. Within hours, suspicion shifted squarely onto him. He was not among the dead. Within hours, suspicion shifted squarely onto him. The brutality of the killings, the deliberate staging of the explosion, and his absence made it almost certain. Robert Fisher had murdered his family and fled. The manhunt began immediately. Law enforcement agencies across Arizona were alerted, and Robert's face was broadcast on every television screen in the state. The next major lead came on April 20th, 10 days after the murders, when Robert's 1999 Toyota 4Runner was discovered in the rugged terrain of the Tonto National Forest, near the small town of Young, Arizona. The SUV was parked in a remote area, partially hidden among the trees. Inside, officers found his dog, Blue, miraculously alive. Alongside were camping supplies and clothing, suggesting Fisher had planned for survival in the wilderness. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Had Fisher vanished into the vast Arizona wilderness, living off the land as a former firefighter and outdoorsman? Or had he staged the vehicle to mislead investigators before slipping away into another life? The terrain around Tonto National Forest was treacherous. Caves, canyons, and miles of unforgiving desert. If he had gone in on foot, the wilderness could have consumed him. Yet no remains were ever found. No camp, no weapon, no trace. By the end of April 2001, Robert William Fisher was officially a fugitive, wanted for the murders of his wife and children. His name and face were plastered across newspapers, television, and later, the internet. The FBI, recognizing the brutality of the crime and the possibility that he had fled across state or national lines, took up the hunt. In June 2002, just over a year after the murders, Fisher was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, alongside terrorists and career criminals. His profile described him as armed, dangerous, and possibly living under a new identity. For the community of Scottsdale, the pain lingered. Mary's friends mourned the quiet, kind woman who had confided her unhappiness. Brittany's classmates struggled to understand how their lively friend had been taken in such a cruel way. Bobby's Little League team placed his name on their roster one last time. The tragedy was not only the destruction of a family, but also the betrayal at its core. A husband, a father, had chosen violence over love, control over compassion, annihilation over acceptance. Part 2 closes with the image of a man on the run. Robert Fisher had committed one of the most brutal family annihilation crimes in American history, and yet he had vanished into thin air. Whether hiding in the wilderness, starting a new life under an assumed name, or lying dead in an unmarked grave, his absence became its own haunting presence. For the FBI and for Mary, Brittany, and Bobby's surviving relatives, justice remained unfinished. In the weeks after the inferno that consumed the Fisher home, Scottsdale was transformed from a desert suburb into a landscape haunted by fear and speculation. Everyone knew Robert Fisher's name, and his face stared out from posters taped to gas stations, grocery stores, and bus stops. Television anchors repeated his description: 6 feet tall, around 190 pounds, with blue eyes and dark hair that might by now have been shaved or disguised with a beard. He was described as outdoorsy, a skilled hunter, and someone familiar with survival techniques. The message was clear: Fisher was dangerous, and he could be anywhere. The FBI entered the case formally on July 19, 2001, filing federal charges of unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. A year later, in June 2002, they placed him on the 10 most wanted fugitives list. His photograph sat alongside terrorists and cartel leaders. His crime described in blunt detail: slit the throats of his wife and children, shot his wife, and destroyed the home with an explosion to conceal the murders. For law enforcement, it was not just about catching a fugitive. It was about tracking down a man who had slaughtered his family and vanished into the American wilderness. The discovery of Fisher's Toyota 4Runner in the Tonto National Forest became the most tantalizing clue. Officers found it parked in a remote area known for its caves, cliffs, and canyons. Inside was his dog, Blue, tired but alive, as if waiting for his master's return. Nearby, a few of Fisher's personal belongings, a hat, some clothes, and camping gear, were scattered. Search teams combed the area for days. Helicopters hovered above. volunteers scoured trails, and cadaver dogs sniffed the earth. The forest was unforgiving, filled with rocky terrain and dangerous wildlife. But despite the exhaustive efforts, there was no trace of Fisher, not a footprint, not a campsite, not a body. This absence led to two dominant theories. The first was that Robert had died in the forest, his body hidden by the vastness of the wilderness. Perhaps he had entered one of the many caves in the region, places so deep and twisting that even experienced searchers struggled to navigate them. If Fisher had crawled inside one and ended his life, his remains could still lie undiscovered, shielded by rock and darkness. The second theory, far more chilling, was that Robert had escaped. As a former firefighter and outdoorsman, he had the skills to survive off the land long enough to cross into another region. From there, he could have slipped into Mexico, where rumors of sightings began to emerge in the years following the murders. Eyewitnesses reported seeing a man resembling Fisher in various towns near the border. In 2004, a married couple on vacation thought they recognized him in a bar in Guadalajara. In 2009, another sighting was reported in a different part of Mexico, but none of these tips could be confirmed. Each lead faded, leaving only uncertainty in its wake. As time passed, Fisher's case gained a grim sort of mythology. The FBI released age-progressed images of what he might look like with graying hair, a beard, or even altered facial features if he had resorted to plastic surgery. Yet none of these generated the breakthrough investigators hoped for. The mystery endured, feeding speculation in true crime circles and among amateur sleuths who debated endlessly online. Was Fisher hiding in plain sight, living under a new name with a new family? Had he joined a community in Mexico where no one asked questions? Or was his body still out there, crumbling to dust in the desert? For the victims' families, the passage of years brought no comfort. Mary's relatives struggled with the knowledge that her life had been stolen by the man who had promised to protect her. Friends remembered how she had confided about Robert's controlling behavior, about her fears of divorce, and how those worries had turned into a death sentence. Brittany and Bobby's schoolmates grew up, finished their studies, and built lives of their own, always carrying the memory of two children whose futures were erased by their father's hands. The FBI has never wavered in their assessment of Fisher. He is armed, dangerous, and capable of violence if confronted. On multiple occasions, the Bureau received tips that seemed promising, but each time the trail went cold. Over the years, false arrests of men who resembled Fisher made headlines. In 2004, a man in Canada was detained after being mistaken for him. In 2011, another man in Colorado was briefly considered, but DNA evidence quickly cleared him. The fugitive seemed to slip further into the shadows, a ghost just beyond reach. By the 2010s, Fisher had become one of the longest-running fugitives on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. His case was unusual in its endurance. Most fugitives are caught within a few years or found dead. Fisher, however, remained an open wound in the justice system, a reminder of how someone could commit an act of unimaginable brutality and then simply vanish. The legacy of the case is one of contradiction. On one hand, it is a story of extreme brutality, a man who destroyed the very people he was supposed to love most. On the other hand, it is also a story of mystery, how a man so recognizable, whose face has been broadcast for decades, could remain uncaptured. Scottsdale moved on from the immediate shock, rebuilding and returning to its rhythms, but the scars remained. The house on East Del Camino Street where the murders took place was reduced to ashes. Today, only an empty lot remains, a silent monument to the crime. Robert William Fisher would be 64 years old today if alive. His profile remains active on the FBI's website, complete with his physical details, his likes, hunting, fishing, camping, and his history of violent temper. For investigators, the hope of solving the case still lingers. The possibility that one day someone will recognize a face in a crowd, submit a DNA sample, or stumble upon bones in a desert cave keeps the file open. Yet in another sense, Robert Fisher already achieved his twisted version of control. He killed his family rather than face abandonment, destroyed the home that held their memories, and disappeared into the wilderness or into a new identity. For over 2 decades, he has denied his victims the justice they deserve. He remains a figure of both fear and fascination, a family man turned fugitive, a killer whose absence has become as haunting as his crime. The story of Robert William Fisher is not one of closure, but of haunting silence. His name continues to echo on FBI bulletins, true crime podcasts, and in the memories of those who knew Mary, Brittany, and Bobby. It stands as a brutal reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are not strangers lurking in the shadows, but the people who live under the same roof, who sit at the same dinner table, and who wear the mask of a husband and